Excellent. So I'm excited to continue the CHRO Spotlight with Severine. Severine, you want to tell us a few words about what you do and what Sportradar does?
Sure. So I'm the Chief People Officer at Sportradar now since 3 years. Time flies. And Sportradar, we are at the intersections of sports, tech, and data. So what we do is we collect and process data and provide also platforms for the world of sports that covers sportsbook, leagues, federations, government bodies for integrity, and also media and broadcaster. So I have the privilege to work with the founder who has took the company public 3 years ago in the US, and it's a hyper growth organization. So that's me, and more than 23 years in the field of people and organization.
Welcome, welcome. And there's so many reasons why I was excited to have you, your profile, what Sportradar does, but also the fact that it's still a founder-led organization, even though it's quite big meanwhile, which always fascinates me because we all know founder-led organizations tick differently. So I want to dive into that. I want to start from sort of a more broader topic because obviously you've done, you had different experiences before this. So founder-led versus CEO-led, what would you say some of the differences are between how the leadership team ticks, how the decisions are being made? Are there any differences? Like your observations, and perhaps what are the pros and what are some of the cons?
Yeah, sure. There are similarities and there are differences, as you can imagine. Um, the founder also made in our organization the transition from being a founder to a CEO, right? And I was exactly hired also for that, which is a dynamic journey, let's put it that way. But let me point out on maybe the similarities first. Similarities, it's always about how you tackle challenges. And it doesn't really matter if you're founder or if you're, I would say, more corporate or traditional CEO. I think the challenges that need to be tackled are similar, and uncertainty, this paradox between having a lot of information and at the same time so much uncertainty, the fact that you need to have foresight and at the same time being executors. So that I do not see different.
Yeah.
What I do see quite different, and that was interesting, is the emotional component. So founders tend to be potentially even more invested in the enterprise, and it's normal. I just understand it's a creation, right? So you see the company that you have founded, and in the case of Sportradar, quite successfully, he founded this company from scratch, and we are now over the billion revenue, and we're stock listed. So he's a successful entrepreneur and founder, but at the same time, I think that emotional attachment will never go away, and the connection with people. I guess the pros and cons is he's very close to people, which is wonderful. Sometimes now it's about how you lead at scale, right? And the transition is brings more challenges there, but we're working towards that.
How many people are you now, employees in total?
We're about 4,500. Yeah.
That's definitely not a point at which you can have a personal, yeah. Although the Chanel CEO still does, I mean, so, okay, very good. I love that. The emotion, of course, the emotional piece of it, I don't think it can ever go away, but it's still remarkable like that, the founder has been able to transition into the CEO role successfully like that. I think is very interesting. Speaking of more specifically, the topic of the day, which is the executive influence, and one of the things I'm a big kind of advocate for is that it's not only the CEO that should be the ambassador, but like Yolanda said, it's like it should be anyone sitting around the executive table carrying that responsibility for representing the organization and that influence that comes from the top, especially in shaping the cultures. What are your observations in terms of what works and where do you feel like there's still a gap in terms of, where we need to grow as leaders at the top?
I love that question. I would also take in the ecosystem boards,
Yeah.
right? Because boards are less I would say, visible for the workforce, but they are definitely in the driving seat behind the seats, right? So we should not also underestimate the influence of boards and how an organization is then also answering to boards' requests or expectations. But back to your question, I think on the evolution, there's so many components, but I said leaders and leaders at the top. What I do see as a challenge, sometimes missing, sometimes something that needs to be strengthened, is I would say, to simplify a bit, 3 dimensions. One is on the self. If I have to look on the self, leaders, Yolanda mentioned vulnerability. Absolutely. I will build on that resilience. Because if we cannot be resilient versus what is happening outside and inside, you cannot expect that from your workforce, right? I always say, I'm not in pharma. I used to work in pharma, but I tell my teams, take your own medicine before you give it to others. And your own resilience will set the pace for the resilience of the organization. So that's one thing. And there's some work to do, right? So it's, I would say, I speak to also peers and other colleagues within or outside the organization. It's a work in progress. On the team aspect, is how congruent you are. I think the congruency, and again, building on what has been said before, you cannot have the trust of your ecosystem. And talking about you, again, the ecosystem is quite talking about a large ecosystem. It's your employee base, it's your board, your shareholders, it's your clients, it's your network, all of that. And you cannot be at the top and not be congruent. You lose the trust. You lose the trust of your employee base, you lose the trust of the investors, of your board, and therefore being really clear on how congruent you are with what you say, what you do, and how you do it. And you touched upon culture. I do think one of the most difficult tasks today is to be a bridge builder, because the workforce, with what is happening in the external world, you have some element of polarization, you have some multi-generations, you have the technology, you know, all of that. And the workforce expects somehow that your organization will be at least a place where there is some kind of framework and or stability. And everybody knows it's not 100% stable and things are changing. But if in the way you work, in the direction that you provide, and in the way you decide and behave, you are not delivering that, you are losing everyone, right? So I think this is another thing that we talk a lot about the task and what to do and strategy, etc. I always say, you know, that's great, but who's going to do the work, right? So, and that element of framing, being a bridge builder, framing how you do things, gives confidence to people, gives an element to stability. It doesn't mean that we don't evolve and do not transform, but this is the things that what was potentially underlooked is becoming even more prominent now, that those are elements that are critical for the sustainability of your organization.
Yeah. I love it. There's so much I want to dive into, but I want to start from the resilience piece. And I love what you said, like the resilience of your people is going to mirror your personal resilience as a leader. And I thought, wow, it's so true. Like I could think of immediately some examples of that, but I'm curious, give us some examples of like, what does resilience, like we have a lot of leaders in the room, what does it look like? How do we demonstrate that we are resilient?
Specifically when things don't go according to plan. When things are, going according to plan, everybody's happy, all fine. It's that day-to-day thing. You had a plan, you had a day, you had something that you didn't foresee, right? So how you tackle that, how you show up, how you build connections, how do you are vulnerable, but how you bring people together to solve problems. And you accept that actually things do not according to plan. So vulnerability also shows that hey, it's not something that did work. Now we have to change and pivot, and let's do that together. So making sure that people feel comfortable, right? So we talk a lot about psychological safety, and there are so many different dimensions. But I would say, at least in that context, bring people to people the way and the comfort to know that, hey, we can pivot and we should pivot, and that's okay, right? And that's a journey. And I always say, you get knocked out, go back on the ring. So that's what the motto I apply to myself.
Yeah.
But I'll say to the team, hey, you're going to get knocked out at some point, and that's okay, but you go back on the ring, right? So yeah, it's and that's why, you know, the way we show up, the energy that you bring in the room, very important. People feel that, right? And actually, if you do not spread that stamina in the morning, right, in spite of what's happening, it will trickle in the organization, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. The stamina. It's and get back in the ring, right? And also like to normalize things not going according to the plan is kind of part of the plan. Like of course, things are never going to go always according to the plan, and it's okay, right? It's part of business as usual. The congruence piece is really fascinating to me, and I'm going to combine it with the bridge building because I find those two in combination fascinating. And here's what I'm thinking: like, so I work with a lot of leadership kind of executive teams, and one thing they're finding challenging is you know, they're being asked to be congruent as a leadership team. So when they walk out of that room, to be perfectly aligned, that the messaging is aligned, the tone is aligned, the level of detailed sharing is aligned, all of that. And at the same time, by the time they do all of that, in the midst of managing change, let's say, right? And in the midst of something big happening, like I said, there is a lot of sort of empty space, and the bridge is not there because they're behind closed doors trying to align on what are we actually, what's our message, right? And so I find that a really delicate balance. Like it's always that delicate dance. At what point do we say we are aligned enough to go in front of our people, right? We don't need to have. I've worked with leadership teams who wanted to have the script perfectly. I'm serious, wanting to get the script perfectly approved that they're going to go with to their teams. And I just don't think that's the way to go. And I don't think you can actually effectively lead an organization these days that way with the amount of change you need to handle. So, in your experience, you know, what does that balance look like between, you know, keeping that bridge open and continuing to build the bridge towards your people and perhaps external shareholders, stakeholders, all of that, and making sure that when you go out there, you're somewhat aligned?
No, absolutely. We talked about trust a bit earlier on. You did that. It starts with that, and you can disagree. Gosh, I mean, if you do not disagree in the room, where do you? Right? You'd better do that in the room than outside. And to your point, when you do that outside, this is where it trickles down. So the the most important is to have and to establish within any team, whether it can be more visible when it's at the top, but I would say with any team, the rules of the game. So who, in the end, how do you make decisions? It sounds as simple as that, but how do you make decisions? You know, and I'm provocatively say I'm not a fan of harmony, but false harmony. Yeah. When you put things under the carpet, but not under the table, right? So everybody agrees in the meeting, and then the meeting happens outside the room. And you, for any organization and top team, you should avoid doing this. And this is where also congruency is definitely a piece, right? And having the debate, the healthy debates around the issue without compromising on the value system. So if you ask me congruency, where I saw it tested is when the own value system of one individual versus maybe a group or an organization is not aligned anymore. Then it's a different conversation, right? But as long as your core value and as a team and as an organization, your value system are the same, you can disagree on the issue. And you should sometimes. It's very healthy. But once you say agree to disagree and commit. I'm a big fan of Lencioni, Patrick Lencioni. You probably know him. But I definitely work with these principles for years. It's definitely that.
Yeah, I love, first of all, I love how you use sports terminology in leadership, like the rules of the game, get back in the ring. Yes, it is. It's fascinating to me, like this idea of like aligning, you know, and how that looks like, and like you said, the harmony. I couldn't agree more. Like whenever I hear we're a harmonious team, my red flag goes on. I'm like, that's not something to be proud of as a leadership team. Like, and it's really not your, part of your job description to be harmonious, right? And there's a lot of dysfunctional harmony, right? There's a lot of harmony for the sake of harmony, but behind that, we're actually not having the hard conversations we need to be having. So I always say, if you want to become a high effective team, you need to embrace conflict. Conflict is your friend, but respectful conflict. And like you said, we don't, also these days with the pace of change, we just don't have the time to keep discussing until we all agree. So we just need to move faster. And that often means that we're not going to all agree. But yet when we leave the room, we all need to be equally committed. That's what you said, right? Commit, agree to disagree, and commit. And I think back to what Yolanda was saying, where I see the gap sometimes, we kind of nod and say, yes, we'll do it. And we go out and we communicate. However, the stamina, the energy, everything behind it, people can read into that and say, well, they're saying this message, but they're not really behind it. So therefore, I'm not either, right? And that creates friction in the organization. That's where it starts. And how has your role evolved over the years as the CHRO and sort of the role of your voice in that room? I'm curious.
Different context, right? So I will look at Sportradar, but I had different work for different companies. I do think, in general, if I have to put a trend, it always comes with a lesson learned. So over the years, the roles have evolved with, the foundations of what needs to happen, right? I do think when companies and organizations have seen something not working, examples, your performance on sales perspective is not working. Sales incentive, reward strategies, maybe we need to look at that. That's important. Companies who went actually bankrupt or wrong because of a wrong cultural compass. Yeah. Our culture is important. We found out that culture is important. Competitive advantage because a company was innovating and working in a certain way. Ways of working, upskilling, reskilling. So I do think the role has evolved naturally because the organization has been tested, has been learning from within and outside. And I think the competitive landscape has just forced really organization to look at the role and what's required, not only from a process and numbers and outputs, but input and actually from a human perspective. Yeah.
In other words, they've learned the real cost of making wrong people decisions.
Somehow, yes.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? The ripple of wrong people decisions. And like what Yolanda was saying, people sustainability, I find that such a beautiful concept, because we think of sustainability of all the other resources, but I'm not sure that we think of people in that way often enough. So thank you so much. This has been such an inspiring conversation. As we wrap up, and I want to get questions from the audience, tell me, what inspires you to do what you do?
When I see the potential in every individual. That's why I wake up. When I have a bad day, I remind myself that because I see it in my teams and the people. And it's really nice and quite rewarding to see what one can do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're gonna, yes. Yes, well deserved. Thank you, Severine. It was absolutely awesome.